All right, thanks everybody for being here. Is there sufficient evidence to believe in the God of the Bible? Once upon a time, there was a rationally justified belief that the sun orbits the earth. It's one of the clearest examples I can think of where a position was both rationally justified based on the available information and understanding at the time, and yet ultimately false. Even those who might hypothesize that the earth was spinning initially had no foundation for arguing this. You could look up and see the sun moving across the sky. We could observe what happens when you spin objects. Why didn't we fly off? And with no understanding of gravity, the universe looked very different. Ultimately, we realized that this position wasn't rationally justified, and then we realized that it was simply wrong. We had a belief, we investigated, we learned that we simply didn't have good reasons to think it was true, and then we reached a model that demonstrated it was false. That hasn't stopped people from arguing for a geocentric universe. Even to this day, there's a new film out that argues on behalf of this position again. But when it comes to the claim that a God exists, or that the God of the Bible exists, as we're debating today, I'm not convinced that belief was ever rationally justified, but I'd argue that it certainly isn't rationally justified today, even if we never reach the point where we have a clear model that demonstrates that it's false. There's a default position when we're talking about rational beliefs. Do you believe every claim until it's proved false, or do you disbelieve, withholding your acceptance of the proposition until it's demonstrated that you're rationally justified to accept it? The former puts us in the position of believing contradictory claims, forcing a state of cognitive dissonance and potentially inhibiting the exploration that might uncover the truth. After all, if you believe God's responsible for the diversity of life, you might never discover that evolution serves not only as a naturalistic explanation, but it's sufficient to the task without requiring a God. It doesn't violate any laws of nature. The latter, withholding belief until it's justified, encourages discovery and puts us in a better position to ensure that our internal model of reality maps as accurately as possible to reality. It's worth noting that there's a difference between I do not believe X and I believe X is false, or I believe not X. This is a distinction that Eric and I have had difficulty discussing in the past. In a trial, the claim is that the defendant is guilty. If I say I do not believe that the defendant is guilty, that doesn't mean that I am convinced that the defendant is innocent. That's a separate proposition of which I'd need to be convinced. In the case of all gods, I find them not guilty of existing, in part because it's the default position, and in part because I've not been presented with sufficient evidence to accept that they exist. In the case of the many versions of the God of the Bible, I also find them not guilty of existing, and there are quite a few that I would probably also find innocent because they are self-contradictory or because they are in direct conflict with what we understand about reality. We need some way of rationally evaluating the evidence for a claim, whether it's guilt or existence. But how do we go about this? How much evidence is enough? What criteria do we use? The scientific method is rigorous for very good reason. Basically, it's a truth filter, and the goal is to minimize the number of false propositions that make it through that filter. Skepticism makes use of critical thinking and a layman's version of a scientific method to establish a default position that we should question everything and accept only those explanations that are strongly supported. When we evaluate the God of the Bible, where do we begin? The concept isn't well defined. There are over 1,000 denominations that disagree on nearly every point of doctrine. They have different views of soteriology, the process by which one achieves or is granted salvation. They have different views of what we're being saved from or to. Is there a hell? What is heaven like? They have different views of the character and values of God. And this mess leaves us in a position of being left with the, quote, God of the Bible being loosely defined as some powerful being that may or may not be all-powerful, but is generally viewed as being the most powerful being possible, though we have no way of knowing how much power is possible or even what power even means in this context. This being may or may not exist outside of space-time, a concept which is completely incoherent because existence is necessarily temporal. So we don't even have the right language to discuss what it means or even if it's possible to exist outside space-time or even if there's anything outside of space-time. This being may or may not act within the world, perhaps, or perhaps not, on behalf of the request of the faithful. Matthew 18:19 says, if two of you on earth agree about anything they ask for, it will be done for them by my Father in heaven. Clearly, no two believers have ever agreed and asked for anything worthwhile, like an end to poverty or the fact, or even that God might reveal himself to me. This being may or may not act in accordance with his plan or only in accordance with his plan. The God of the Bible is defined differently by each of his adherents. While this puts us in the awkward position of not being able to pinpoint a definition to confirm, this does demonstrate rather clearly that there isn't sufficient evidence to rationally justify belief. But I think it goes further. The various denominations and interpretations demonstrate that Christianity doesn't have a coherent God concept to address. What does this tell us about their God? Either he's the worst communicator one could imagine, or he simply doesn't exist. There's no clear correction to doctrine. The New Testament, even when viewed as Bible 2.0, doesn't really clarify anything and doesn't have any more evidence behind it than the Old Testament. This God apparently created the entire universe, stuck us in it, gave us a brain that uses reason to discover all the truths about reality, and then he's either intentionally hiding or he doesn't exist. If the God of the Bible were real, then either he cares about the fact that so many people misunderstand him or he doesn't. If he cares, he hasn't bothered to correct this, and that creates a reductio ad absurdum that demonstrates that this God either doesn't exist or doesn't care. If he doesn't care that people misunderstand him, then this contradicts what people believe about him, which means that each of their self-constructed God models, wherein God cares that they understand him correctly, is false and self-contradictory, and the God that they believe in doesn't exist. These clear problems with doctrine and individual views of this poorly defined God are not only the reason that we have many hundreds of different denominations, it's the reason that Christian apologists tend to defend the various arguments that point to a deistic God instead of actually defending the God they believe in. Today's debate, though, is based on Eric defending the God of the Bible, so we'll let him give his definition, which he's done, and we'll examine it. Is it a defense of the God of the Bible, or is it yet another defense of deism? If he presents this clear model of his version of the God of the Bible, one of the immediate questions we have to ask is, why that model? What is it about Eric's version of the God of the Bible that's better or more clear than anyone else's? What kind of gods could exist? And we know as a fact that either a God exists or it doesn't. Those are the only two possibilities. And if it doesn't, then we're done. If it does exist, then either it manifests in reality in some detectable way, or it doesn't. And if it doesn't, once again, we're done, because the God that doesn't exist is indistinguishable from the God that doesn't manifest in reality. And if it does, and this seems to be the God that most people believe in, manifest in reality, a God who answers prayers, performs miracles, intervenes and intercedes on behalf of the faithful, then what do we do? Well, that seems like a testable proposition. And we've tried testing it. People run around claiming to be little God detectors and having a personal relationship and getting messages, which seems strange to me because I can easily demonstrate, and so can they, every other personal relationship they have, which seems to make this particular relationship a bit of special pleading. When arguing on behalf of God, most of the common arguments boil down to some version of, well, what better explanation is there other than God did it, which is a version of the argument from ignorance fallacy that's been labeled by Dawkins and others as the argument from personal incredulity, which is actually just an expression of the fact that some people are so uncomfortable with not knowing that they'll accept whatever answer seems best. But God has no explanatory power. The God concept cannot explain a thing. It's a panacea that could serve as an answer for anything, and thus is an explanation for nothing. Not only does it suffer from this fatal flaw, but we explain things in terms of other things that we understand or can clearly demonstrate, neither of which applies to God. So we're just trying to answer a mystery by appealing to a bigger mystery. But it also bleeds to death and vanishes when we apply Occam's razor. If it's okay to propose an all-powerful, vastly powerful, supernatural, magical cause, then we should also be able to propose a less powerful, supernatural, magical cause that is sufficient to what we're trying to explain. Something godlike with respect to the thing we're trying to explain, for example, the origin of the universe. Powerful universe-creating pixies become more plausible than God because they don't have the added baggage of being able to do anything. They're a better explanation, though still no explanation at all. Unfortunately for theists, there's no way to test or falsify their claims. And the claims have no explanatory power, and we can propose less inflated versions of magical beings that are sufficient to the task, and worse. As we explore the universe in which we live, we discover that nothing about it requires any thinking agent to violate the laws of nature in order to accomplish anything. And the comparisons that we make within the universe, we cannot logically extend these to the universe itself. It's a unique scenario. It's like saying, hey, why are photons the only thing that can instantly accelerate to light speed? That doesn't make any sense. We have nothing with which to compare it. And when we're talking about universes, we have no other universes with which to compare our current one. So I don't know how one can presume that they have come up with the cause and that it necessarily needs to be a personal agent, which then becomes the Christian God. If we live in a world with a God and that God can do anything, we can trust nothing. Science goes right out the window. Maybe that heart medication really works, or maybe God just made it look like it works, or maybe God's going to change the way it works. And there's people who would argue that without God, we can have no reason. But I'd argue that it seems likely that there can be no reliable reasoning within reality about the facts of reality if that reality includes a God that can change those facts. Much like the sun orbiting the Earth, we're clearly in a position where we know enough to know that some claims simply aren't rationally justified, and the God of the Bible is one of them.